Hi, welcome to Fish on Fridays. I'm McCauley. In the last episode, I talked to you about the differences between a doctrine and a dogma. And just to remind you, a dogma is something that's an official teaching. And if a pope speaks ex cathedra, that means from the chair, that means it's an infallible teaching. It won't be changed or revoked. And I mentioned at the last episode that there were only twice has this happened in history that a pope has spoken infallibly. And both of those teachings had to deal with Mary. Now, I'm taping this episode and the next one in the month of May, and the Catholic Church reckons the month of May as Mary's month. And so I figured this would be as good a time as any to talk about these very important teachings. So today I want to focus on the Immaculate Conception. And I would be willing to bet if you asked 100 Catholics to define the Immaculate Conception, you'd probably get 80 to 90 of them who would say that it had to do with Jesus being conceived in his mother's womb, which is incorrect. Now, in the defense of those 80 to 90 who would get that wrong, I would suggest that if you go to Mass on the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, which we celebrate in our liturgical calendar every year on December 8th, if you go to Mass, it's a holy day of obligation. Every year you're going to hear the same readings. The gospel reading that's proclaimed on December 8th, the Immaculate Conception, is always the same. It's Luke's gospel, and it recounts when the angel Gabriel visits Mary and announces that she'll be the mother of God. And so it's easy to understand why people would say it sounds like that's the reading that tells us how Mary conceived Jesus. Of course, it would truly be a miracle to conceive Jesus on December 8th and then give birth 17 days later on the 25th. But that's another issue. The Immaculate Conception truly has to do with Mary's conception in her mother's womb. The idea is that when Mary was conceived in Anna, her mother, tradition tells us her mother's name was Anna. When Mary was conceived in her mother's womb, unlike you and I, she was preserved from original sin. Now, you might ask, well, why? Why is that significant? It's significant and important because, and by the way, this was codified and made official, if you will, at the Council of Ephesus in 431. Pope Leo the Great was the guy who was in charge of that particular council. And in the council said very, very clearly that Mary is Theotokos. Now, that's a Greek word that means God bearer, that Mary gave birth to the second person of the Trinity, the human and divine Jesus, that in terms of that role and playing that part in our salvation history, the thought is that she needed to be sinless so that she could give birth to the sinless Jesus. So it's a very important feast to remember. And before we get hung up on the idea of Mary is perfect and Mary is without sin, it's important to understand Mary's own words in Luke's gospel. After she is pregnant and she goes to visit her cousin Elizabeth, she says in her own words, "My spirit rejoices in God, my Savior." So Mary recognizes that she needs a Savior and that she was saved at the beginning of her life, where you and I hopefully are saved at the end of our life. And so her being preserved from original sin really was important to set the stage, if you will, for salvation to occur, for Jesus to be born and then to live his life, to suffer, die, and rise. The other thing it should tell us, the Immaculate Conception should tell us, is like every teaching about Mary that Catholic Church holds, every teaching about Mary does two things. It tells us something about ourselves that we hope for ourselves. So in this instance, if we say Mary is without sin, we hope to live our lives without sin. That's the model that we try to follow. The second thing it tells us is every time we say something about Mary, it really is not about her. It reflects off of her and points to her son. The idea of Mary being conceived without original sin really doesn't make sense apart from her son and Jesus's role in our salvation. And so from the incarnation all the way to the resurrection, everything about Mary's role in that, in the life of Jesus, really is about bringing Jesus forth to us, bringing Jesus to our consciousness so that we can ultimately be saved. So that is the dogma of the Immaculate Conception. Next week, I want to talk to you about the dogma of the Assumption of Mary. Until then, please be good to each other and God bless.